The vampire king returned 3 hours before destiny allowed, and the maid who should have been invisible pressed her finger to her lips and whispered 2 words that shattered everything: "Stay silent." At that moment, Lucian Drakemoor, ancient, absolute, untouchable, obeyed a command for the first time in 8 centuries. What he discovered in the moonlit corridors of his own castle would prove that the greatest horrors don't announce themselves with fangs and bloodshed. They hide in the spaces you've forgotten to protect. In the rooms where the people you love have learned to disappear. Lucian Drakemoor didn't believe in weakness. But standing in his obsidian halls with ceremonial frost still clinging to his cloak, he wondered if cruelty itself had turned against him. Elena Thorne, the maid with trembling hands and steel in her eyes, pressed desperate fingers to her lips. "Stay silent." Her voice was barely a breath, but it carried the weight of life and death. In Lucian's world, no one gave him commands. He had ended the blood wars with a single decree. He ruled the northern territories from shadow and ice. An immortal king whose power could freeze hearts with a glance. Yet something in Elena's terror, fear sharpened into desperate courage, made him freeze. "What has happened in my domain?" His voice emerged like frost over stone, each word a blade of controlled fury. Elena grabbed his arm with strength no human should possess, pulling him away from the grand entrance toward the darkened servant corridors. Her fingers dug into his coat with desperation that transcended protocol. "If you reveal yourself now," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air, "it will only seal her fate." Lucian's ancient heart, a thing that hadn't truly beaten in centuries, stuttered. Seraphina. His daughter. His only child. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Before we dive into tonight's tale of whispers, frost, and devastating secrets, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me, would you stay silent to protect someone, even if speaking could save them? Because Elena is about to make that choice, and it will change everything. Now let's begin. Lucian Drakemoor had ruled the northern territories for 847 years. Long enough to see empires rise and crumble. Long enough to forget what it felt like to be uncertain. His castle, Blackspire Hold, rose from the frozen mountains like a crown of obsidian and silver. Its towers pierced the perpetual twilight that shrouded these lands, and within its walls, vampires from every ancient bloodline came to pledge fealty, to negotiate treaties, or to die trying to challenge his authority. None succeeded. Lucian's power wasn't just strength, it was inevitability. But power had a price. And that price was measured in absences. 3 months away at the Crimson Conclave, negotiating territorial disputes that would have ignited another blood war without his intervention. 5 weeks before that, presiding over the tribunal of old bloods, settling disputes that had festered for centuries. 2 months prior to that, commanding military operations along the southern reaches, where rebel factions still refused to acknowledge his supremacy. Necessary absences. Essential duties. The work of maintaining an empire that spanned half the known world. His daughter understood. Of course she did. Seraphina was his blood, born of his union with Isolde Nightshade 3 centuries ago, before consumption took Isolde's immortal life in a tragedy even vampires couldn't prevent. Seraphina was strong, resilient, the perfect heir to a throne that demanded perfection. At least, that's what Lucian had believed. Morgana Ashenfell had entered Lucian's life 7 years ago, during a summit of the Elder Houses. Beautiful in the way winter was beautiful, cold, pristine, absolutely merciless. Her lineage traced back to the first bloodlines, her power formidable, her political acumen sharper than any blade. Their union was practical. Not love. Lucian had buried that with Isolde, but alliance. Morgana brought the loyalty of 3 vassal houses and control over the eastern trade routes. In return, she gained the title of Queen Consort and authority over Blackspire Hold during Lucian's frequent absences. She'd promised to care for Seraphina, to guide her, to be the maternal presence the girl had lost. Lucian had believed her. Why wouldn't he? Morgana was composed, intelligent, perfectly suited to manage the domestic sphere while he secured the empire's future. He'd been gone more in the past 3 years than he'd been present. The threats to his rule were constant. challenges from ambitious houses, territorial disputes, rebellions that flared like wildfires and required his personal attention to extinguish. During his absences, reports arrived regularly from Morgana. Serafina is progressing beautifully in her studies. The child is learning discipline and composure. All is well within Blackspire, my king. Focus on the Empire. Your daughter is in capable hands. All is well. All is well. All is well. The words had become a lullaby, soothing Lucian's rare moments of guilt when he wondered if he should return home more often. But duty called. The Empire demanded. And Serafina was strong enough to understand. Wasn't she? The return. Tonight's summit had ended early. 3 houses had agreed to terms far more quickly than anticipated, a miracle, or perhaps exhaustion from centuries of conflict finally outweighing pride. Whatever the cause, Lucian found himself departing the Obsidian Hall 3 hours before the formal adjournment. He'd sent no word ahead. Protocol demanded advance notice of royal movements, but something, instinct perhaps, or the faint unease that had been gnawing at him for months, made him choose silence. The journey through the frozen pass took 2 hours by shadow flight, the landscape below a blur of white and black. When Blackspire Hold finally rose before him, its familiar silhouette should have brought comfort. Instead, something felt wrong. The castle's usual bustle was absent. No guards patrolled the outer ramparts. No servants moved through the courtyards preparing for his return. The place felt hollow. Lucian landed silently in the shadow of the eastern tower, his boots touching stone without sound. Centuries of predatory instinct whispered warnings through his consciousness. Something is not as it should be. He moved toward the main entrance, already planning to summon Morgana for a report on why security protocols had been abandoned. Your Majesty! The voice came from the darkness. Elena Thorne stepped into the moonlight, her maid's uniform spotless as always, but her face carried a desperation that stopped him cold. And then she pressed her finger to her lips. Stay silent. The corridors of silence. Elena led him through passages he'd walked 1,000 times but never truly seen. Servant corridors, too narrow for nobles to bother with. Stairs that smelled of soap and stone. The hidden arteries through which Blackspire's invisible staff moved to keep the castle functioning. She said nothing as they walked, but her body vibrated with tension. Her hand, when she reached back to guide him around a corner, trembled like a bird's wing. Lucian could have demanded answers. Could have frozen her where she stood until she explained this bizarre behavior. But something stopped him. The same instinct that had made him return early. The same whisper that said, watch. Understand before you act. They climbed. Higher into the castle's residential wings where the royal family's chambers occupied the northern tower. Serafina's rooms were on the 3rd floor, a suite of spaces Lucian had designed for her himself. Windows overlooking the frozen gardens. A library filled with books from every corner of the empire. Everything a vampire princess could desire. As they approached the corridor leading to those chambers, Elena slowed. She positioned Lucian behind a pillar carved with ancestral crests, a hiding place, he realized with mounting dread. A vantage point from which to observe unseen. Watch, Elena whispered, her voice breaking. And understand why silence is the only mercy left. From his concealed position, Lucian could see down the corridor. Moonlight spilled through tall windows, painting everything in shades of silver and ash. The hallway was empty except... not empty. There, kneeling on the marble floor like a prisoner awaiting execution, was a small figure in white. Serafina. His daughter. His only child. The girl who should have been asleep in her chambers, safe, protected, loved. She knelt with her spine perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap with geometric precision. Her breathing followed a deliberate pattern. 4 counts in, hold for 7, release for 8. This wasn't rest. This was discipline. The kind of training Lucian recognized from his own brutal education 8 centuries ago, taught to prisoners and slaves to demonstrate absolute submission. His daughter had learned to make herself disappear. The breaking point. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Morgana Ashenfell emerged from Serafina's chambers, moving with the lethal grace that had first captivated Lucian's political interest. Tonight, she wore midnight silk that whispered against the stone, her silver hair unbound and flowing like a waterfall of ice. Beautiful. Composed. Absolutely in control. She circled Serafina like a predator assessing prey. 3 hours and 47 minutes, Morgana said, her voice smooth as poisoned wine. An improvement from last week, when you shifted at 3 hours and 12 minutes. Do you remember what happened then, child? Serafina's voice emerged barely above a whisper. I began again. You began again, Morgana confirmed, her tone almost pleasant. Because discipline without consistency is merely cruelty, and I am not cruel, Serafina. I'm simply preparing you for the truth your father refuses to acknowledge. Lucian's hands clenched into fists behind the pillar. Frost spread from his fingertips, creeping across the stone in fractal patterns. Tell me what you are, Morgana commanded, crouching to Serafina's eye level. The pause was barely a heartbeat. Then, disappointing. The word detonated in Lucian's chest like consecrated silver through his heart. If you are listening to this story and feel it touching something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if it's not too much to ask, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, because we treasure every word you share with us. Morgana stood, satisfaction flickering across her perfect features. Disappointing. Your father built an empire on strength, on absolute certainty. He ended the blood wars because the elder houses respected his capacity for necessary violence. She began pacing, circling the kneeling child. You carry his blood, but blood alone proves nothing. Do you understand? Yes, my lady. Not mother, Morgana corrected softly. You haven't earned such intimacy. Your mother was weak, Serafina. She loved too easily, felt too deeply. That softness killed her just as surely as the consumption. And I will not, her voice hardened, allow her failure to infect you. The lie was perfect. Isolde had been strong, brilliant, beloved by all who knew her. Her death had been tragedy, not weakness. But Morgana had rewritten that grief into a weapon, transforming loss into evidence of genetic inadequacy. Lucian felt something crack inside his ancient chest. Not his power. His certainty. Behind him, Elena's hand touched his shoulder. A grounding weight. Not yet, her touch said. You need to understand fully before you act. Morgana pulled something from her robes, a device that gleamed with captured magic. She activated it, and images sprang into the air between them. Moving pictures, stolen moments, recorded by surveillance magic woven into the castle's very stones. Look, Morgana commanded. The first image showed Serafina being dragged by her hair across polished marble. The child made no sound. No crying, no protest. Just teeth clenched in silent endurance, like a warrior who'd learned that screaming only made punishment worse. The second recording, Serafina sat in the corner of her chambers, face turned toward the wall. Morgana approached and, without warning, her hand struck the child across the face with enough force to leave frostburns on immortal skin. Serafina stumbled but didn't cry out. Then Morgana's voice, cold enough to extinguish stars, your mother would have been ashamed of what you've become. Weakness should have died with her. The third image showed Serafina kneeling, just as she knelt now, for hours. Her small body trembling with exhaustion, but holding position with mechanical precision. 6 months, Morgana narrated to the kneeling child, her tone almost conversational. For 6 months, I've been shaping you into something worthy of the Drakemoor name. Your father sees only the empire, the territories, the treaties, the endless political theater. He's forgotten what it means to build true strength. She crouched again, forcing Serafina's chin up. But I haven't forgotten. And when he finally returns, if he ever truly returns, he'll find you transformed, perfected, or... The pause hung heavy with threat, or broken beyond repair. Either way, you'll no longer be the weak, mewling thing your mother left behind. Behind the pillar, Lucian trembled. Not from cold. from rage so absolute it threatened to crack the castle's foundations. Elena's hand tightened on his shoulder, her touch the only thing anchoring him to sanity. Her other hand moved to his wrist, guiding his attention to a small cloth bag she'd carried. Inside were documents. Testimony from servants too terrified to speak openly. Medical records showing injuries explained away as training accidents. Letters Morgana had written to allies in other houses, discussing her education methods, with clinical detachment. And a ledger. A careful, methodical accounting of every cruelty inflicted over the past 6 months. Dates, times, methods. Documented with the precision of someone who understood that truth required evidence. Elena had been watching, recording, waiting for this moment. Lucian looked at this mortal woman, this servant who should have been invisible, and saw something that humbled him, courage that transcended survival. She'd risked everything to preserve proof, knowing that speaking without evidence would doom them both. "How long have you known?" he whispered, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "For months since I found her unconscious in her chambers," Elena breathed. Morgana had locked her in the meditation room for 3 days. No light, no sound, no one coming. When I finally convinced the guards something was wrong. Her voice caught. Serafina didn't run to me, didn't cry. She simply knelt in the center of that dark room and waited for instruction. As if punishment was all she knew how to expect anymore. The weapon. In the corridor, Morgana produced a small blade from her robes. Not steel, something older. Bone, carved with runes that pulsed with sickly light. Lucian recognized it immediately. A soul-binding knife. Illegal under the accords that had ended the blood wars. Capable of breaking a vampire's will and reshaping it to the wielder's design. "Tonight," Morgana said softly, "we take the next step in your education." She pressed the blade's flat edge against Serafina's forehead. The child flinched, the first involuntary response Lucian had witnessed, but didn't pull away. "This is a gift," Morgana continued. "A tool your father would never allow, bound as he is by outdated laws and sentimental weakness. But I'm not bound. I am free to do what's necessary." The knife began to glow, its magic seeping toward Serafina's consciousness like poison through clear water. "When this is complete, you'll want only what I want. Feel only what I allow. You'll become the perfect vessel for my will, silent, obedient, unquestioning. Your father's empire will pass to you, but through you, it will answer to me." Serafina's eyes widened. For the first time, genuine terror broke through her trained composure. "Please," the word escaped her lips like a prayer. "Please, I'll be better. I'll be perfect. Just not that. Please not that." Morgana smiled. "Oh child. This is you being perfected." Lucian moved. Centuries of predatory speed compressed into a single moment. He crossed the distance between pillar and corridor faster than thought, his hand closing around Morgana's wrist with enough force to shatter mortal bones. The soul-binding knife clattered to the marble floor, its foul magic dissipating harmlessly into the air. Morgana's head snapped around, eyes wide with shock that transformed instantly into calculation. "Lucian." His name emerged from her lips almost pleasantly, as if she'd been interrupted during a mundane task rather than caught attempting to enslave their daughter. "You're early." "Yes," he said softly. "I am." Behind him, Elena scooped Serafina into her arms. The child remained frozen, unable to process her father's sudden appearance, unable to reconcile his presence with 6 months of learning that no one would come. Lucian's red eyes, the color of ancient power and barely contained fury, fixed on his consort. "How long?" "How long what?" Morgana's composure was already returning, her political mind calculating angles and responses. "How long have you been unmack my daughter?" "Silence." "Answer me," Lucian commanded, and his voice carried the weight of 8 centuries of absolute authority. The castle itself seemed to shudder in response. Morgana's perfect mask finally cracked. Rage flickered across her features, not at being caught, but at being questioned. 6 months of undoing the damage you inflicted," she hissed. 6 months of trying to forge strength from the weak, mewling creature your indulgence created. She cried for you every night, Lucian. Every single night for 2 weeks before I taught her that tears were pointless. You taught her that I was pointless, Lucian interrupted, his voice dropping to something deadly quiet. You taught her that love was weakness. That hope was foolish. That survival meant silence. Survival does mean silence. Morgana's composure shattered completely. Do you think this empire runs on sentiment? On feelings? You've spent centuries building power through calculated violence, and now you recoil because I applied those same principles to your daughter. She is a child. She is an heir. She is the future of this bloodline, and that future cannot afford weakness. The corridor had grown cold enough that frost crept across the walls. Lucian's power, barely leashed, manifested in the temperature drop that made even Elena, still holding Serafina, shiver despite her mortal warmth. You don't understand what you've done, Lucian said softly. You can't. Because you've never loved anything more than power. Morgana laughed, bitter, sharp. And you have? You, who left your daughter for months at a time. Who chose treaties and territories over tucking her into bed. Who trusted me to raise her because you couldn't be bothered to stay. Each word landed like a blade. Because each word carried truth. You're right, Lucian said, and the admission seemed to surprise Morgana more than his rage had. I failed her. I chose wrong. I believed that securing the empire was the same as protecting my child. He stepped closer, and Morgana actually retreated, the first sign of fear crossing her perfect features. But I failed through absence. You failed through cruelty. And only one of those failures is unforgivable. It's a choice. You can't touch me, Morgana said, recovering her composure. The Ashenfell Alliance. 3 houses, 12 vassal lords, control of the eastern trade routes. Touch me, and you lose 1/3 of your empire's stability. The other houses will see it as tyranny, as a king placing personal vendetta above political necessity. She was right. Lucian could feel the weight of that truth settling over the moment like a suffocating blanket. I am your queen consort, Morgana continued, pressing her advantage. Bound to you by treaties older than most living vampires. Breaking that bond means breaking those alliances. You'll fracture your own empire for the sake of... My daughter, Lucian interrupted softly. Say it. Make yourself speak the words. The sake of my daughter. Morgana's jaw tightened. Sentiment is a luxury kings cannot afford. Then perhaps, Lucian said quietly, I'm tired of being king. The words hung in the frozen air like a prophecy. Morgana stared at him, genuine shock breaking through her political armor. You can't possibly... Watch me. Lucian turned away from her and moved to where Elena still held Serafina. The child's eyes, ancient and young simultaneously, met his with an expression that broke something fundamental in his chest. She didn't recognize safety in his presence. She recognized authority. Power. Another figure who might hurt or help depending on calculation rather than love. He knelt. The king of the northern territories, ruler of half the known world, conqueror of the blood wars, knelt before his daughter on the cold marble floor of his own castle. Serafina, he said, and his voice, that weapon he'd used to command armies, emerged as something broken and tentative. I'm so sorry. The child blinked. Confusion warred with trained responses. Was this a test? Another lesson in disappointment? I failed you, Lucian continued, tears he didn't know he could still produce, burning in his eyes. I chose wrong. I trusted wrong. I believed that duty to the empire was the same as duty to you, and I was catastrophically mistaken. His hand reached out slowly, giving Serafina every chance to flinch away. When she didn't move, he gently touched her small shoulder. You are not disappointing, he said fiercely. You are not weak. You are not a vessel to be shaped or a problem to be solved. You are my daughter. And from this moment forward, that means something. Serafina's carefully constructed mask cracked. A single tear escaped, trailing down her cheek like liquid silver in the moonlight. But the Empire, she whispered, her voice small and uncertain. Lady Morgana said you need the alliances. That I have to be strong so you can rule. Then the empire can burn, Lucian said simply. Because no throne is worth this. No alliance justifies what was done to you. And any power built on your suffering isn't power I want to hold. Behind them, Morgana made a sound of disgust. Pathetic. This is what happens when immortals forget what matters. 800 years of building, and you'd throw it away for... Leave. Lucian's command cracked through the air like a whip. Tonight. Take nothing but what you arrived with. The Ashenfell alliance is dissolved. The treaty's null. And if you ever return to my territories, I will show you exactly what 8 centuries of calculated violence looks like when it's no longer calculated. For a moment, Morgana simply stared. Then understanding dawned, he meant it. Every word. She drew herself up, dignity wrapping around her like armor. You'll regret this. When the houses turn on you, when your empire fractures, when you remember why kings can't afford to be fathers, you'll regret this moment. Perhaps, Lucian agreed. But I'll regret it alive. Standing beside my daughter. And that's a choice I can live with. Morgana's heels clicked against marble as she departed, her silk robes whispering like winter wind through dead leaves. The castle seemed to exhale as she passed through its doors, as if releasing poison that had been building in its stones. Serafina remained rigid in Elena's arms, her small body vibrating with the effort of processing this impossible turn. Her father had returned. Her tormentor had left. The world had inverted in the space of minutes. Is this real? She finally whispered, the question barely audible. Or another test? Lucian felt those words cut deeper than any blade. It's real, he said gently. And I swear to you, Serafina, there will be no more tests. No more lessons in cruelty disguised as strength. You are safe now. But you'll have to leave again, the child said, her logic cutting through emotion with heartbreaking clarity. For summits and treaties and the empire. You always leave. Then the summits can wait. The treaties can be delayed. The empire. Lucian paused, understanding the full weight of what he was about to commit to. The empire will learn to function with a king who chooses presence over perfection. He looked at Elena, still kneeling beside them. Thank you. For seeing what I was too blind to notice. For having the courage to show me the truth. Elena's eyes were wet. She reminded me of my younger sister, she admitted. Before the purge took my family. I couldn't be silent again. Lucian nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Elena wasn't just a maid. She was a survivor of one of his own political purges, families destroyed in the name of stability and order, casualties of the same pragmatic cruelty Morgana had embodied. I can't undo what was done to your family, he said quietly, but I can ensure that no child suffers such loss again in my name. Help me. Teach me to see what power makes invisible. Elena glanced at Serafina, who'd finally begun to relax in her arms. I'll stay for her, she said simply. Not for you. For her. That's more than I deserve, Lucian agreed. The reconstruction of trust is slower than its destruction. Lucian learned this truth in the days and weeks following Morgana's departure. Serafina didn't suddenly transform into a carefree child. The damage ran too deep, carved into her consciousness through 6 months of systematic cruelty. She still woke screaming from nightmares. Still flinched at sudden movements. Still spoke in whispers as if volume itself was dangerous. But slowly, achingly slowly, small changes emerged. The first breakfast, 3 days after, Lucian asked Elena to bring Serafina to breakfast in his private chambers rather than the formal dining hall. The child entered like a soldier reporting for inspection, spine straight, hands folded, eyes downcast. Sit with me, Lucian said gently, gesturing to the chair beside his own rather than across the long table. Serafina obeyed, her movements precise and measured. Are you hungry? He asked. The pause. If you wish me to be, father. The response drove ice through Lucian's heart. She couldn't even name her own hunger without seeking permission. I'm asking what you want, he clarified softly. Not what you think I want to hear. Are you hungry, Serafina? Longer pause. The child's brow furrowed with concentration, as if this was an impossibly complex question. Finally, I don't know. Truth is, a foundation to build from. Then we'll try something, Lucian suggested. I'll put food on the table. You can eat whatever calls to you. Or nothing at all. There is no wrong answer. He laid out options: blood fruit from the southern orchards, pastries from the castle bakery, warmed spiced wine that smelled of cinnamon and cloves. Then he began eating his own meal, making no commentary, offering no judgment. For 5 long minutes, Serafina simply sat, staring at the food as if it were a test with hidden traps. Then, tentatively, her hand reached out. She selected a single blood fruit, examined it with the careful attention of someone expecting poison, and took a small bite. Lucian continued eating, acting as if nothing significant had happened. But inside, something eased in his chest. One choice. One small act of autonomy. It was a beginning. Lucian woke to screaming. He moved through the castle faster than thought, arriving at Serafina's chambers to find Elena already there, trying to wake the thrashing child from whatever horror gripped her sleeping mind. "Serafina," Elena called gently, keeping distance to avoid being struck by flailing limbs. "You're safe. You're in your chambers. Come back." The child's eyes snapped open, wild, unseeing, still trapped in whatever nightmare scenario her trauma had conjured. "Please," she sobbed, words tumbling out in fragments. "Please, I'll be better. I'll be silent. I'll be perfect. Don't use the knife. Please don't use the knife." Lucian's hands clenched. Even banished, Morgana's cruelty lived on in his daughter's dreams. He knelt beside the bed, keeping his movements slow and visible. "Serafina, listen to my voice. The knife is gone. Morgana is gone. You're safe." But the panic had her fully in its grip. She scrambled backward against the headboard, her small body shaking violently. "I'll be good," she pleaded. "I promise I'll be good." "You are good," Lucian said firmly. "You don't have to earn safety. It's not something you achieve through perfection. It's simply yours. Always." The words seemed to penetrate. Serafina's breathing slowed fractionally, her eyes beginning to focus on his face. "Father." The word emerged tentatively, as if testing whether this was real or another dream trap. "I'm here," he confirmed. "And I'm not leaving. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until you believe that I mean it." He stayed in the chair beside her bed, reading aloud from books she'd loved before Morgana's reign of terror, until dawn light crept through the windows and she finally fell into peaceful sleep. Elena found him there hours later, still sitting vigil. His eyes met hers, and she saw the exhaustion in them, not physical weariness, but the bone-deep fatigue of someone confronting the magnitude of their failures. "She has nightmares every night," Elena said softly. "Sometimes multiple times." "Then I'll be here every night," Lucian replied. "However long it takes." The library, 2 weeks after. Lucian learned that Serafina had loved books. Before Morgana, she'd spent hours in the castle library, reading histories and fairy tales with equal enthusiasm. Now the library stood abandoned, dust gathering on volumes she no longer dared touch. He found her one afternoon standing in the doorway, staring at the shelves with an expression of such longing it physically hurt to witness. "Would you like to choose a book?" he asked. She shook her head. Lady Morgana said reading was indulgence. That time spent on stories was time wasted. "Lady Morgana," Lucian said carefully, "was wrong about many things. Stories matter. They teach us that we're not alone in our struggles. That others have survived darkness and found light again." Serafina looked up at him, vulnerability breaking through her trained composure. "Did you read stories? When you were young?" He knelt, bringing himself to her eye level. "I did. And they saved me more times than weapons ever did." "Even though you're a king?" "Especially because I'm a king. The crown gets heavy, Serafina. Stories remind me that I'm still a person beneath it." He held out his hand, an offering, not a command. "Read with me? We'll choose something together." After a long moment, her small hand slipped into his. They selected a volume of fairy tales, one Lucian remembered Isolde reading to Serafina when she was barely old enough to understand words. They sat in the window seat overlooking the frozen gardens, And Lucian began to read. His voice, that weapon he'd used to command and condemn, became something different. Gentle. Patient. A tool for healing rather than power. Halfway through the second story, Serafina leaned against his shoulder. Just slightly. Testing whether comfort was allowed. Lucian didn't react visibly. Didn't comment or draw attention. Just continued reading, letting her make choices at her own pace. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's what Elena had told him. Healing wasn't linear. Some days Serafina would smile. Others she'd retreat back into trained silence. The progress was measured in moments, not milestones. But moments accumulated. And slowly, the child who'd learned to disappear was remembering how to take up space. The consequences Morgana had predicted arrived exactly on schedule. 3 houses formally dissolved their alliances. 2 more demanded renegotiation of trade agreements. Whispers circulated through the noble courts. The king has gone soft. Choose his daughter over his empire. Weakness masquerading as sentiment. Lord Theron Ashenfell, Morgana's brother, called for a formal summit to address the instability Lucian's decision had created. Lucian could have refused. Could have crushed the dissent with the same calculated violence that had ended the blood wars. Instead, he called the summit himself. The elder houses assembled in Blackspire's Grand Hall, ancient vampires whose bloodlines stretched back to the First Darkness, nobles who'd pledged fealty when Lucian was barely a century old, and ambitious lords who saw opportunity in perceived weakness. They expected justification, defense, perhaps even apology. Lucian gave them truth. I stand before you, he began, his voice carrying through the vast space, not to defend my choices, but to acknowledge them. Yes, I dissolved the Ashenfell alliance. Yes, I banished my queen consort. Yes, I prioritized my daughter over political convenience. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. And I would do it again, Lucian continued, because I have spent 8 centuries building power on a foundation I believed unshakable. Strength through dominance. Security through control. The suppression of weakness in all its forms. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the assembled nobles. That foundation was a lie. The murmurs grew louder. Lord Theron rose, his face flushed with indignation. You dare call 8 centuries of stability a lie? The order you've maintained, the wars you've prevented, were built on the same principle my consort used to torture my child, Lucian interrupted coldly. The belief that cruelty is strength, that suffering builds character, that love is weakness to be suppressed. He stepped forward, and the sheer force of his presence, 8 centuries of accumulated power, made even the eldest nobles shrink back. Morgana didn't invent that philosophy. She learned it from observing us. From watching how this court operates. How we treat those with less power. How we justify casual cruelty as necessary and call it politics. Your daughter is a single child, another noble protested. The empire spans territories, houses, millions of subjects. You'd risk all of that for? Yes, Lucian said simply. I would. Because an empire that requires child abuse to function is not an empire worth maintaining. And a throne that demands I sacrifice my daughter's sanity for stability is not a throne worth holding. Silence fell like snow in the great hall. I am offering you a choice, Lucian said, his voice softening slightly. Reaffirm your allegiance to this throne under new terms, where power is measured not just by dominance, but by protection of the vulnerable. Where strength includes the capacity for mercy. Where kings can be fathers without being called weak. He paused. Or leave. Dissolve your alliances. Build your own kingdoms. I won't stop you. Because I'm tired of ruling people who believe cruelty is virtue. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lady Seraphine Nightshade, one of the oldest vampires present, a contemporary of Lucian's 1st century, stood. You're right, she said quietly. And we all knew it. We've simply become too comfortable with the alternative to admit it. One by one, other nobles rose. Not all of them. Lord Theron and his faction departed in fury, but enough. More than enough. The empire fractured. But what remained was built on something stronger than fear. It was built on choice. Progress wasn't linear. Some days Serafina seemed almost like the child she'd been before. Others, she retreated so deeply into silence that even Elena struggled to reach her. But there were moments. Small victories that accumulated like snowfall. One evening, as Lucian read to her in the library, Serafina interrupted him. "Father." He paused mid-sentence. "Yes. Why did you kneel? That first night. When you could have just commanded me to trust you?" Lucian closed the book, giving the question the weight it deserved. "Because command would have been another form of violence," he said carefully. "You'd spent 6 months learning that your voice didn't matter, that your needs were irrelevant, that you existed to serve others' expectations." He met her eyes, those ancient young eyes that had seen too much. "I knelt because I needed you to understand something. Your suffering mattered more than my pride. Your healing mattered more than my authority. You were not below me in importance, you were above me. And sometimes, the strongest thing a king can do is acknowledge when he's been catastrophically wrong." Serafina considered this with the serious concentration she brought to all difficult questions. Then, slowly she shifted closer on the window seat. Her hand, small and still bearing faint scars from frostburns, reached out and touched his arm. Just rested there. A point of contact freely given. Lucian didn't move. Didn't speak. Just breathed carefully, letting her set the pace and boundaries of this moment. "I think," Serafina said softly, "I'm beginning to believe you mean it. That you're staying." "I am," Lucian confirmed. "Not perfectly. I'll still make mistakes. But I'm staying. And when I do leave, for essential duties that can't be delegated, you'll know exactly when I'll return. And I'll keep that promise." The hand on his arm tightened slightly. Trust, tentative and fragile, but growing. Outside the window, snow began to fall over Blackspire's frozen gardens. Inside, a father and daughter sat together in comfortable silence, rebuilding connection one careful moment at a time. The assassination attempt came 2 months after Morgana's banishment. Lucian woke to alarms shrieking through the castle's wards. He moved instantly, shadows carrying him to Serafina's chambers faster than thought. He found Elena already there, standing between Serafina's bed and 3 figures in dark cloaks. Blood dripped from a gash on Elena's arm, and she held a fireplace poker like a sword, her stance desperate but defiant. Lucian's rage manifested physically. The temperature in the chamber plummeted. Frost exploded across walls and windows. One of the attackers simply froze solid mid-motion, his body encased in ice. The other 2 tried to flee. They made it 3 steps before Lucian's power seized them, holding them suspended in air. "Who sent you?" His voice was winter and death. No answer. Their mouths moved, but no sound emerged. Compulsion magic, Lucian realized. They'd been bound to silence even under torture. He could break them. Years ago he would have. Now, with Serafina watching from her bed with wide, terrified eyes, he made a different choice. "Sleep," he commanded, and magic crashed over the assassins like a wave. They collapsed, unconscious. "Guards!" Lucian called, and Blackspire's security forces flooded the chamber. "Take them to the holding cells. Full binding wards. I want answers about who sent them." As the guards removed the unconscious attackers, Lucian turned to Elena. Blood still flowed from her wounded arm, but she stood firm. "You saved her," he said quietly. "It's my duty," Elena replied, though her voice shook. "It's beyond duty," Lucian corrected. "It's courage that transcends obligation." "Thank you." He moved to Serafina, who sat frozen in her bed, eyes too wide, breathing too fast. The familiar signs of panic beginning to take hold. "I'm here," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "You're safe. They didn't hurt you." "But they tried," Serafina whispered. "They came for me. Because of Lady Morgana?" "Possibly," Lucian admitted. "Or because others view your importance to me as leverage. Either way, they failed. And they will continue to fail." He pulled her into his arms, slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, and felt her small body trembling against his chest. "I won't let them take you," he promised. "Ever." The interrogation. The assassins broke under questioning. Not through torture. Lucian had meant what he said about choosing different methods, but through exhaustion and the relentless pressure of truth compulsion magic that made lies physically painful. The truth, when it emerged, was worse than simple revenge. Morgana hadn't sent them. She'd been a symptom, not the disease. The conspiracy ran deeper. 3 elder houses had been coordinating for decades, viewing Lucian's iron rule as an obstacle to their own ambitions. Morgana had been their tool, placed close to the king, tasked with undermining him through his daughter. The plan: break Seraphina completely, either turning her into a puppet they could control after Lucian's eventual death, or driving Lucian himself to such distraction that his grip on power weakened. The assassination attempt was desperation. When Lucian had chosen Seraphina over the Empire, when he'd begun rebuilding his rule on different principles, they'd realized their long-term strategy had failed. So they'd opted for a more direct approach: kill the child, shatter the king, seize power in the chaos. Lucian listened to this revelation with growing cold fury. Not the explosive rage of the first night, but something colder, more calculated. He'd thought Morgana was the enemy. She'd been a weapon wielded by those he'd considered allies. Lucian called another summit. This time, not to explain himself, but to extract justice. The 3 conspiring houses, Ashenfell, Mordain, and Corvith, arrived expecting negotiation. They found a king who'd rediscovered the capacity for necessary violence. "You used my daughter," Lucian said, his voice carrying through the grand hall with terrible quiet, "as a battlefield. You broke her mind to break my power. You thought my love for her was weakness to exploit." Lord Theron Ashenfell stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "These accusations require evidence, Your Majesty. You can't simply—" "I have your letters," Lucian interrupted. "Your coordination with Morgana. Your plans to seize territories during the instability you predicted would follow my daughter's complete psychological collapse." He gestured, and Elena, no longer in servant's garb but dressed as Lucian's official advisor, stepped forward carrying documents sealed with house sigils. 20 years of correspondence, Elena said clearly, her voice carrying new authority. "Detailing exactly how you plan to unmake this throne from within." The conspiring nobles paled. They'd never imagined a servant would have access to such records, let alone the intelligence to recognize their significance. "You have a choice," Lucian said. "Abdicate your holdings. Dissolve your house's authority. Accept exile to the border territories where your ambitions can die in obscurity." He paused. "Or face me in trial by combat. All 3 of you. Simultaneously. And discover what 8 centuries of controlled violence looks like when I stop controlling it." No one chose combat. The houses fell. Their territories were redistributed to nobles who'd remained loyal or neutral. Their names were struck from the rolls of honor. And the message spread throughout the empire: the king had changed. He was no longer the distant, pragmatic ruler who valued stability above all else. He was something more dangerous now. He was a father who'd been pushed too far. 6 months after Morgana's banishment, Seraphina laughed. Not a polite, controlled sound. A genuine burst of delighted laughter as she watched snow fall in the gardens, something Elena had said striking her as genuinely funny. Lucian heard it from his study and stopped mid-sentence in the middle of a treaty negotiation with visiting dignitaries. That sound, pure joy, unfiltered by fear or trauma, was more important than any political agreement. "Excuse me," he said to the startled nobles. "My daughter needs me." He found Seraphina and Elena building a snow sculpture in the courtyard, the child's hands covered in ice as she shaped frozen crystals with more enthusiasm than skill. "Father," Seraphina called when she saw him. "Elena showed me how to make the frost dance." She demonstrated, her small hands moving through magical passes that made snowflakes swirl in intricate patterns. Amateur work, technically imperfect, but filled with joy that no amount of technical mastery could replicate. "It's beautiful," Lucian said honestly. "Teach me." For the next hour, the king of the Northern Territories learned snow sculpture from his daughter while visiting dignitaries waited and treaty negotiations stalled. And he didn't regret a single moment. The conversation, 1 year after. Serafina came to Lucian's study one evening, her expression serious. She'd grown in the past year, not just physically, but in confidence. The child who'd learned to disappear was learning to take up space intentionally. "Father, I need to talk to you about something." Lucian set aside the documents he'd been reviewing. "Always. What's on your mind?" She settled into the chair across from his desk, the same chair where they'd shared countless conversations over the past months. "I've been thinking about Lady Morgana," Serafina said carefully. "About what she did. And why." Lucian tensed, uncertain where this was leading. "What conclusions have you reached?" "She was wrong," Serafina said firmly. "About almost everything. But..." She paused, choosing words with the care of someone who'd learned that words carried weight. "She wasn't wrong about you being absent." The statement hung in the air. "You're right," Lucian said quietly. "I was absent. Far too often." "I understand why now," Serafina continued. "The Empire needs you. The houses need mediation. Wars need prevention. You can't just ignore all of that." "No," Lucian agreed. "But I can delegate more than I did. I can trust others to handle situations that don't require my specific authority. I can say no to summons that are about noble posturing rather than genuine need." He leaned forward. "Most importantly, I can ensure that when I do leave, you know exactly when I'm returning. And I keep that promise. Always." Serafina nodded slowly. I think I'm okay with you leaving sometimes. As long as you always come back." "I will," Lucian promised. "Every single time." She studied him with those ancient young eyes. "And if there's ever a choice between the Empire and me again?" "You," Lucian said without hesitation. "Always you. The Empire can fracture. Thrones can fall. But you're irreplaceable." Serafina smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine. "I'm glad you finally understand that." "So am I," Lucian admitted. "Even if it took me 8 centuries to learn it." 2 years after Morgana's banishment, Blackspire Hold felt different. The castle still rose from frozen mountains like a crown of obsidian and silver. Its towers still pierced the perpetual twilight. But the atmosphere within had transformed. Laughter echoed through corridors that had been silent for centuries. Servants moved without fear. Nobles negotiated with honesty rather than manipulation, knowing that cruelty disguised as strength would no longer be tolerated. And in the northern tower, in chambers overlooking the frozen gardens, a father and daughter shared breakfast. "What are your plans today?" Lucian asked, pouring tea with the careful attention he now brought to small domestic moments. "Elena is teaching me about historical archives," Serafina said, selecting a blood fruit from the platter between them. "Then I promised to help with the new ward designs for the refugee housing." After the conspiracy's fall, Blackspire had opened its gates to vampires displaced by the political upheaval. Serafina had insisted on helping design safe accommodations, drawing on her own experience of feeling unsafe in spaces that should have protected her. "Busy day," Lucian observed. "What about you?" "Summit with the Western Territories. They're negotiating water rights. Should be tedious but important." "Will you be back for dinner?" "Absolutely. I promised to finish that book we started yesterday." Serafina's smile was warm. "But I want to know if the Dragon Prince actually saves the kingdom or just thinks he does." "Ah, the eternal question," Lucian said with mock seriousness. "Are heroes born or made?" "Made," Serafina said with certainty that came from experience. "Anyone can be born with power. It takes choice to become actually heroic." Lucian felt pride swell in his chest. "When did you become so wise?" "When I had a father who chose to listen," she replied simply. Elena Thorne stood in the grand hall, no longer wearing servant's garb but the midnight blue of the King's Council. She'd been formally elevated 2 years ago, her title now Voice of the Unnoticed, an advisor whose role was to see what power overlooked, to question what authority assumed, to speak truth regardless of rank. She'd revolutionized Blackspire's intelligence network by recruiting from those society dismissed: servants, merchants, refugees, anyone trained to move through the world unseen. Today she presented her findings to the assembled council. 3 territories report increased stability, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned her position through courage rather than birth. Crime is down. Trade disputes resolved through negotiation rather than threat. 2 minor houses have formally requested to join the empire under the new principles. Lord Valerian Nightshade, one of the nobles who'd supported Lucian's transformation, nodded approvingly. The king's unorthodox approach appears to be working. Because it's not an approach, Elena corrected gently. It's a fundamental shift in what we value. Power through protection rather than domination. Strength through mercy rather than cruelty. She glanced at where Lucian sat, Seraphina beside him in the position of honor usually reserved for the queen consort. The child, no longer quite a child at 15, listened with serious attention, occasionally leaning over to whisper questions to her father. The empire is smaller than it was, Elena continued. We lost territories when the Ashenfell alliance dissolved. But what remains is stronger, built on loyalty earned rather than fear compelled. And the threats? Another noble asked. Surely there are those who view compassion as weakness to exploit. There are, Lucian said, speaking for the first time. They discover quickly that compassion and weakness aren't synonyms. A king who protects rather than dominates is no less capable of violence when necessary. He's simply more selective about when it's actually necessary. His eyes swept the council. I spent 8 centuries ruling through calculated violence. It worked, in the sense that I maintained power. But it built an empire where cruelty was currency and children learned that love was weakness. He placed his hand on Seraphina's shoulder, a gesture of affection that would have been unthinkable in the old court. This new approach builds slower, costs more in the short term, requires constant vigilance and the willingness to admit when we're wrong. He smiled slightly. But it builds something that lasts. And more importantly, it builds something worth lasting. The council adjourned. As nobles filed out, discussing trade agreements and territorial management, Seraphina tugged her father's sleeve. Can we go to the gardens? Elena promised to show me the new moonfrost roses. Of course, Lucian said, standing. Lead the way. They walked through Blackspire's corridors, father and daughter, accompanied by Elena. Servants nodded respectfully but without fear. Guards smiled rather than standing rigid. The castle had learned to breathe. In the gardens, beneath a sky full of stars and aurora light, they examined the roses Elena had cultivated, blooms that glowed with soft blue luminescence in the darkness. They're beautiful, Seraphina breathed. They only grow in safe places, Elena explained, where the soil isn't poisoned by violence or fear. I've been trying to cultivate them for years, but they never survived until... She trailed off, but they all understood. Until the castle stopped being a place where cruelty lived. Father, Seraphina said, her voice soft in the garden's quiet. Are you happy? With how things are now? Lucian considered the question seriously. The empire was smaller, his power less absolute. His days more complicated by the constant work of building consensus rather than commanding obedience. But his daughter stood beside him, free of nightmares, learning to trust again, growing into someone strong not despite her trauma but because she'd learned that survival and healing could coexist. Yes, he said simply. I'm happy. Even though it's harder this way? Because it's harder this way. Easy power is hollow power. This. He gestured at the castle, the gardens, the world they were rebuilding together. This requires something more than strength. It requires choice, growth, the willingness to admit when centuries of tradition were actually centuries of mistake. He knelt, bringing himself to Seraphina's eye level as he had that first terrible night. You saved me, he said quietly, by being brave enough to survive until I finally saw clearly. By believing I could change even when I'd given you every reason to think otherwise. By choosing to trust again even though trust had been weaponized against you. Seraphina's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. I didn't save you. You saved me. We saved each other, Lucian corrected. That's how family works. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. No hesitation. No fear. Just a daughter embracing her father in a garden that bloomed because violence no longer poisoned its soil. Elena watched from a respectful distance, her own eyes wet. She'd given everything to make this moment possible, risked her life, challenged power, spoken truth when silence would have been safer. And it had been worth it. Every terrifying moment. Every uncertain choice. Every time she'd wondered if courage would be rewarded or simply met with death. Worth it. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in battles. They're won in gardens, in quiet moments, in the simple act of choosing healing over revenge, love over power, presence over prestige. The Vampire King had learned what 8 centuries of dominance couldn't teach, that true strength lay not in the capacity to destroy, but in the courage to protect what mattered most. And what mattered most was kneeling before him now, safe and whole and beginning to believe in tomorrow. The maid who whispered, "Stay silent," saved not just a king's daughter, but the king himself, by forcing him to see what power had made invisible. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't speaking loudly. It's recognizing when silence has become survival, and when survival needs to transform into salvation. Elena Thorne gave up invisibility to make a child seen. Lucian Drakemoor gave up an empire to choose love over legacy. And Serafina learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to believe in tomorrow even when yesterday tried to steal that hope. In the frozen north, in a castle that learned to breathe again, 3 people rebuilt what cruelty had broken: trust, love, and the understanding that family isn't defined by blood alone, but by the choices we make when everything hangs in the balance. The Vampire King returned early. And because he did, because one maid had the courage to whisper a warning, a child who'd learned to disappear remembered how to exist. That's not just a story about salvation. It's a story about what happens when we choose to see the invisible, speak for the silenced, and believe that even ancient monsters can learn to be human again. If this story touched something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe, to like, and to share so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, because we treasure every word you share with us. Until next time, remember, sometimes staying silent saves a life. But knowing when to speak? That changes everything.